There's something almost magnetic about the image of a warrior, not just the steel in their hands, but the fire in their hearts, a fire lit by stories. Think of the Viking who believed he could channel the fury of a bear, or the samurai who saw his sword as an extension of his soul. These weren't just fighters, they were living legends, shaped by myths so powerful they could turn fear into courage and ordinary men into heroes. What if I told you that behind every great warrior society in history, there was a story, a tale of gods, monsters, or destiny that gave them something even sharper than their blades? Across centuries and continents, from the frozen north to the sun-baked plains of Japan, warriors didn't just fight for land or gold. They fought for something far more enduring, a place in the stories that would outlast them. The Norse Berserker didn't simply march into battle. He roared like a beast, convinced the spirit of Odin himself rode with him. The samurai didn't just follow a code, they embodied the honor of ancestral spirits, their every move a stanza in an unbroken epic. These myths weren't just entertainment, they were the invisible armor that made warriors fearless, the compass that guided them through chaos. So why do these ancient tales still grip us today? Maybe it's because they speak to something universal, the human need to believe in something greater than ourselves. When a Spartan stood shoulder to shoulder with his brothers, he wasn't just defending a city, he was upholding the legacy of Heracles. When a Celtic warrior painted his body blue, he wasn't just preparing for war, he was stepping into the skin of a god. These stories didn't just shape history, they became history. And as we unravel them together, you'll start to see their echoes everywhere, from the heroes we celebrate to the battles we still whisper about. This isn't just a journey into the past. It's a key to understanding the unbreakable spirit that myths once forged and how they still live in us today. Take the Vikings, their entire world, was steeped in myth, a tapestry of gods and monsters that didn't just explain the world but shaped how they lived and died. When a Norse warrior gripped his axe, he wasn't just holding a tool, he was carrying the legacy of Thor, the thunder god who battled giants. Their sagas whispered of Valhalla, a hall where only the bravest fallen would feast beside Odin, and that promise turned battle cries into something sacred. Imagine standing in a shield wall, knowing your death could mean an eternity of glory. That's the power of myth. It didn't just motivate, it transformed ordinary farmers into raiders who shook continents. But the Vikings weren't alone. Across the world in Japan, the samurai drew strength from Shinto legends, where every river and rock pulsed with kami, divine spirits. Their sword wasn't just steel, it was a soul forged in the fires of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. The tale of the 47 Ronin warriors who chose honor over life wasn't just a story, it was a blueprint for how to live and die with purpose. These myths didn't just decorate history, they built an unbreakable code, bending reality itself to their will. When a samurai faced impossible odds, he didn't see a hopeless fight, he saw his name etched into legend. Even the Celts, with their druids and oral traditions, wove myths into every battle. Warriors painted their skin with woad, not just to terrify enemies, but to become avatars of their gods. The Morrigan, the shape-shifting goddess of war, wasn't just a deity, she was a presence on the battlefield, her crows signaling fate itself. These stories turned combat into ritual, every clash a chapter in an immortal saga. The myths didn't just inspire, they erased the line between man and myth, making warriors believe they were part of something eternal. That's the secret. These societies didn't just tell stories, they lived them, breathed them, until the tales became as real as the swords in their hands, and that's why their legends still haunt us today. Because when a warrior truly believes he's touched by the divine, history bends to meet him. The Berserkers of the Norse sagas weren't just warriors. They were vessels of divine fury, men who blurred the line between human and myth. Imagine standing on a mist-shrouded battlefield, watching as a handful of figures tore through the chaos, eyes wild, voices howling like wolves. These weren't ordinary fighters. They were Odin's chosen, their bodies humming with a god's rage. Legends say they chewed their shields in anticipation, their teeth gnashing like beasts, their minds lost to a frenzy so potent they felt no wounds, no fear, only the ecstasy of battle. To their enemies, they seemed possessed. To their own people, they were proof that the gods walked among them. But this wasn't mere superstition. The Berserkers' trance had roots in ritual. Some scholars suggest hallucinogenic herbs or frenzied dances under the aurora borealis, practices meant to summon Odin's spirit. Amulets carved with his one-eyed visage have been found in graves, clutched in skeletal hands like tickets to Valhalla. Even their name, Berserker, whispers of their mythic role. Bare shirt, men who wore the animal's spirit like armor. When they charged, they didn't just fight. They became the storm of their own legends, a living terror that shattered enemy lines before a single blow was struck. What's chilling is how these stories fed their reality. A warrior who truly believed he was Odin's avatar fought differently, reckless, relentless, unbound by mortal limits. The myth didn't just excuse their brutality, it weaponized it, and that's the alchemy of these tales. They didn't merely inspire courage, they rewrote the rules of what a human could endure. Now picture the mist shifting from the frozen Norse fjords to the emerald hills of the Celts, where warriors painted their skin not just for war, but for transformation. Like the Berserkers, they didn't step onto the battlefield as men, they stepped on as legends. The Morrigan didn't just watch from the shadows, she wove herself into the very fabric of Celtic warfare. Picture this, a warrior on the eve of battle, scanning the twilight for a flash of black wings. A single crow circling overhead wasn't just a bird, it was an omen, a whisper from the goddess herself. The Celts didn't see battles as mere clashes of steel. They were cosmic dramas with the Morrigan as both playwright and audience. Her prophecies weren't passive predictions, they were calls to action. A warrior who spotted her before combat knew the stakes: fight with unmatched ferocity, or become another ghost in her haunting chorus. Take Cu Chulainn, the Hound of Ulster, whose legend burns brightest in this twilight between myth and reality. The Morrigan didn't just observe his battles, she tested him, cursed him, even loved him in her terrifying way. When she appeared to him as a beautiful woman offering aid, and he spurned her, she retaliated by sabotaging his fights, morphing into an eel to trip him, a wolf to distract him. Yet even in her wrath, she couldn't break him. Why? Because Cu Chulainn understood the unspoken pact. The Morrigan didn't want blind obedience. She wanted warriors who'd stare into her abyss and still swing their swords. That's why his legend endured, not because he avoided her games, but because he played them better. This wasn't just storytelling, it was psychological warfare dressed in divine garb. Imagine the morale boost when a Celtic warband, outnumbered and exhausted, caught sight of crows gathering on the battlefield. To them, it wasn't scavengers, it was the Morrigan's approval, a sign they fought under her gaze. And conversely, the sheer terror when enemies saw those same birds and wondered, had they already been marked for death? The myth didn't just motivate, it manipulated reality, turning superstition into a weapon as sharp as any blade. Now shift your gaze eastward, where another warrior culture turned myth into mandate. The samurai didn't have crows, they had cherry blossoms, fleeting and beautiful, a reminder that honor outlasted life itself. But like the Celts, their battles were never just physical. They were performances for the gods, each strike of the katana a brushstroke in an eternal masterpiece. To the samurai, a sword was never just metal, it was a bridge between worlds. The legendary Kusanagi note tsurugi, one of Japan's 3 sacred treasures, wasn't merely a weapon. It was a fragment of the sun goddess Amaterasu's power, passed down through emperors and heroes. When a warrior drew his blade, he wasn't just holding steel, he was gripping a thread of divinity, a reminder that every swing carried the weight of heaven's will. This belief didn't just inspire courage, it forged an unbreakable bond between the physical and spiritual, turning combat into a sacred act. Consider the ritual of sword-making itself. Master smiths purified themselves with fasting and prayer before hammering molten steel, chanting to the kami as they folded the metal hundreds of times. The finished blade wasn't just sharp, it was alive, a vessel for the smith's spirit and the blessings of the gods. Samurai whispered names to their swords, treating them as companions rather than tools. To lose a blade wasn't just a tactical setback, it was a spiritual rupture, a severing of the bond between warrior and cosmos. Then there's the tale of the 47 Ronin, a story so potent it still echoes in Japan today. When their lord was unjustly forced to commit seppuku, these warriors didn't just mourn, they plotted for 2 long years, disguising themselves as merchants and monks, biding their time until they could strike with surgical precision. Their vengeance wasn't mere violence, it was a performance of bushido so flawless it moved even the shogun. Though ordered to die by their own hands, their sacrifice cemented them as legends. Why? Because they proved that loyalty could outmuscle even death. Their story wasn't just told, it was memorized, recited, and internalized by generations of samurai as the ultimate test of honor. But the kami's influence didn't end there. Before battle, samurai would visit shrines offering prayers to Hachiman, the god of war, or Benzaiten, the deity of art and strategy. They saw omens in the flutter of birds, the direction of the wind, the way cherry blossoms fell. A sudden rainstorm wasn't weather, it was a sign. This wasn't superstition, it was a world view where every moment pulsed with meaning, where the divine whispered through the rustle of leaves. When a samurai faced his enemy, he wasn't just fighting a man, he was fulfilling a destiny written by the gods. Now, journey westward to the sun-baked hills of Greece, where another warrior culture drew strength from their pantheon. The hoplites didn't wield katanas, but their spears were just as sacred, blessed by Ares, tempered by Athena's wisdom. Like the samurai, they didn't march to war alone. They marched with gods at their backs. Greek hoplites didn't just march into battle, they stepped into a story written by the gods. Picture a phalanx advancing, shields locked, each man acutely aware that Athena's wisdom guided their formation or Ares' fury fueled their spears. For them, war wasn't just strategy, it was a sacred drama where divine favor meant the difference between glory and oblivion. Take Achilles, the invincible warrior whose very existence was shaped by prophecy. His mother, Thetis, dipped him in the river Styx to make him impervious to harm except for that single, fateful heel. His legend wasn't just a tale, it was a warning and a promise. Even the greatest heroes were bound by the whims of Olympus. Delphi's oracle wasn't merely a priestess, she was the mouthpiece of Apollo, her cryptic words steering kings and generals toward victory or ruin. When the Spartans consulted her before Thermopylae, her prophecy was clear: either a king must die or the city would fall. Leonidas didn't hesitate. His sacrifice, framed by that divine ultimatum, transformed 300 men into immortal symbols of defiance. The pass wasn't just a battlefield, it became an altar where myth and history fused. Every shield raised that day bore the weight of Hercules' legacy. Every spear thrust a nod to the gods who watched from the slopes of Mount Ota. But the hoplites' connection to the divine went deeper than battlefield inspiration. Before combat, they sacrificed animals, reading entrails like maps of the god's will. A fluttering bird's flight or a sudden thunderclap could halt an entire army in its tracks. These weren't superstitions, they were lifelines to the divine, a way to navigate the chaos of war with the gods as compasses. Even their armor carried sacred symbols, the Gorgon's face to paralyze foes with terror, the image of Zeus to invoke his unshakable authority. Now shift your gaze from the sunlit temples of Greece to the endless steppes of Mongolia, where warriors rode not under the gaze of Olympians, but with the eternal blue sky itself as their witness. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they moved like a force of nature, believing the heavens willed their victories. While the Greeks sought signs in sacrificial flames, the Mongols listened for the whispers of Tengri in the wind, their destiny written not in prophecies, but in the boundless horizon. The wind howled across the Mongolian steppe not as an enemy, but as a voice, one that whispered through the felt walls of yurts and carried the will of Tengri, the eternal blue sky. To Genghis Khan's warriors, this wasn't poetry, it was law. They rode not as conquerors, but as instruments of celestial order, their every victory proof of heaven's favor. The legend of the Golden Whip wasn't just a story, it was a covenant. When young Temujin, later Genghis Khan, found this sacred artifact, it wasn't mere chance. To the Mongols, it was destiny's handshake, a sign that the sky itself had chosen him to unite the tribes. And unite them he did, transforming nomadic clans into an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, all under Tengri's watchful azure gaze. What's striking is how this myth didn't just motivate, it dissolved barriers. Tribes that had feuded for generations now fought side by side, not for plunder, but for a shared divine mission. When a Mongol warrior strung his bow, he wasn't just preparing for battle, he was aligning himself with the cosmic balance. Their tactics, swift, merciless, unpredictable, mirrored the storms that rolled across the steppe, as if the sky itself guided their strategies. Even their enemies spoke of it, how Mongol armies seemed to move with uncanny precision, as though the wind carried their orders directly from the heavens. But the myths went deeper than battlefield morale. The Mongols believed their conquests weren't just permitted by Tengri, they were required. To resist expansion was to defy the sky's will. This conviction turned their campaigns into crusades, their battle cries into hymns. When they spared cities that surrendered and razed those that resisted, it wasn't just policy, it was theology. A spared city proved Mongol mercy, a razed one demonstrated divine judgment. The myths didn't just justify their actions, they absolved them, wrapping brutality in the sanctity of ritual. Now shift your gaze from the windswept plains to the sun-drenched temples of Tenochtitlan, where another warrior culture saw divinity not in the sky, but in the unrelenting glare of the sun. The Aztecs didn't ride horses, they marched barefoot across hot stones, their bodies painted in the colors of gods, their hearts beating in time with Huitzilopochtli's war drum. For them, battle wasn't just a duty, it was the very fuel that kept the sun rising. Aztec warriors didn't just wear jaguar pelts as armor, they became the jaguar, its spirit merging with theirs under the watchful eye of Huitzilopochtli. Every battle was a sacred harvest where captives weren't casualties but lifelines for the cosmos. Imagine the weight of that belief, stepping onto the battlefield knowing your sword strokes didn't just win territory, they staved off eternal night. The Flower Wars, those ritualized clashes with neighboring states, weren't mere skirmishes, they were elaborate feeding rituals for a starving sun. Warriors fought not for land or gold, but for the privilege of dragging bound prisoners up the steps of the great temple, where priests would offer still beating hearts to the heavens. To die in such a battle wasn't tragedy, it was communion. Now, shift continents and centuries to the misty forests of medieval Europe, where another warrior class moved under the weight of myth, not to sustain the sun, but to embody an ideal. Arthurian legends didn't just entertain knights, they sculpted them. When a young squire first heard of Excalibur, pulled from stone by divine right, he wasn't just hearing a story, he was absorbing a blueprint for kingship. The Round Table wasn't furniture, it was a revolution, a mythic challenge to the feudal hierarchy that said even the lowliest knight could earn a seat beside his king if he proved worthy. These tales turned chivalry from a code into a sacrament, every joust and quest a chance to step into Lancelot's boots or Gawain's armor. Consider the Grail quests, those elusive pilgrimages that drove knights to madness and revelation. The Grail wasn't just a cup, it was a test, a mirror held up to the soul. When Percival failed to ask the right question at the Fisher King's castle, his silence didn't just prolong a story. It taught generations of knights that true courage meant curiosity and compassion, not just swordplay. And here's the alchemy. These stories were flexible. A French knight might revere Lancelot as the perfect lover, while a German one emulated Parzival's spiritual rigor. The myths adapted to shape warriors across borders, proving that legends could be both universal and deeply personal. But Arthur's shadow stretched beyond individual knights. His mythos forged entire institutions, the Order of the Garter, modeled on the Round Table's fellowship, castles designed to evoke Camelot's splendor, even coronation rituals borrowing from his sword in the stone destiny. When Henry VIII staged jousts in Arthurian garb, he wasn't playing dress-up, he was tapping into a narrative that legitimized his rule. That's the power of these stories. They didn't just guide warriors, they built kingdoms in their image. Now picture a young page, wide-eyed by firelight, listening as a troubadour sings of Tristan's tragic love or Galahad's purity. In that moment, history and myth blurred. The boy wouldn't grow up to fight dragons, but he might crusade in Jerusalem, defend the weak, or swear oaths on relics, all while measuring himself against those luminous archetypes. The legends didn't just inspire, they haunted, whispering that greatness wasn't born, it was chosen, one honorable act at a time. From the blood-stained temples of Tenochtitlan to the candlelit chapels of Christendom, one thread connects these warrior cultures. They didn't just believe their myths. They let their myths believe in them, until every swing of a sword or tilt of a lance became part of an eternal story. And perhaps that's why we still tell these tales today. Not because we've outgrown them, but because we still recognize that same hunger, to be more than flesh and bone, if only for a moment. The legend of the Holy Grail wasn't just a story, it was a mirror held up to the soul of medieval knighthood. Picture a young knight kneeling in a dim chapel, his armor still dented from battle, listening as a priest describes the Grail not as a golden cup, but as a test of the heart. To seek it meant more than adventure. It demanded a purity so fierce it bordered on impossible. The Grail's allure wasn't in finding it, but in what the quest revealed about the seeker. Sir Galahad, the spotless knight, could glimpse its radiance because his very existence embodied its ideals, while Lancelot, for all his strength, was blinded by his earthly passions. This wasn't just fiction, it was a moral compass forged in myth, one that real knights used to navigate the chaos of war and politics. Take the story of Percival, the naive youth who stumbles into the Grail castle. When he fails to ask the Fisher King the healing question, whom does the Grail serve? His silence isn't just a plot twist, it's a lesson etched into the minds of every noble son. True knighthood required curiosity and compassion, not just skill with a blade. Monasteries and courts alike circulated these tales, turning them into guidebooks for behavior. A knight who cheated at tournaments might face ridicule as a man who'd trade the Grail for a barrel of wine, while one who showed mercy in battle earned whispers of Galahad's grace. The myths didn't just inspire, they policed, their judgments sharper than any sword. Then there's Excalibur, the sword that chose its king. Unlike ordinary weapons, it wasn't forged in a furnace but drawn from stone by divine right. The message was clear: power wasn't taken, it was bestowed. This idea reverberated through castles and coronations, shaping how kings justified their rule. When Richard the Lionheart wielded his sword on crusade, chroniclers painted it as an Excalibur for a new age, a symbol that his conquests were ordained by heaven. Even failures twisted the myth to their advantage, claiming their own sword in the stone moment was yet to come. But Arthur's legends did more than glorify kings. They redefined what it meant to be a warrior. The round table, with its level circle where no man sat above another, was a radical notion in a world rigid with feudalism. It whispered that honor wasn't inherited but earned, an idea that trickled into real-life orders like the Knights Templar, where low-born men could rise through piety and prowess. When a squire scrubbed his master's armor, he wasn't just doing chores, he was preparing for his own seat at the table. Now, shift your gaze from the misty forests of Camelot to the sun-scorched savannas of southern Africa, where another warrior culture drew strength from legends far older than Arthur's. The Zulu didn't seek grails, they communed with ancestral spirits, their battle songs echoing with the voices of those who'd fought before them. Where European knights saw divine will in swords, the Zulu saw it in the wind that carried the whispers of their forefathers, urging them toward greatness. Zulu warriors didn't just march into battle, they moved as if the earth itself willed their footsteps. When Shaka seized the throne, he didn't just reorganize an army, he rewrote destiny, blending myth and strategy until they were indistinguishable. The buffalo horns formation wasn't merely tactics, it was revelation whispered to him by the ancestors in a dream, a divine blueprint where warriors became the horns to encircle, the chest to crush, and the loins to finish the fight. To the Impi, this wasn't just a maneuver, it was sacred geometry, a dance choreographed by the Amadlozi themselves. Picture the moment before combat, warriors smearing their bodies with white clay, not for camouflage but transformation. The chalky streaks weren't paint, they were the breath of the ancestors, a visible pact between the living and the dead. Spears weren't thrust blindly, they were guided by unseen hands, their iron tips humming with the approval of those who'd fought before. Even the rhythm of their war chants, the deep, thudding stomps of feet, mirrored the heartbeat of the land. When the Impi charged, it wasn't just men running, it was the past and present colliding, a storm of tradition and divine fury. Shaka understood something primal. Myths don't just inspire, they rewrite reality. His own legend grew so potent that enemies would falter at the mere rumor of his approach. Stories claimed he could raid the wind for omens, that his shield could deflect fate itself. But the true genius was how he weaponized belief. By tying his reforms, the shorter stabbing spear, the relentless drills, to ancestral will, he made innovation feel like revelation. A warrior training until his hands bled wasn't obeying a king, he was honoring the spirits. That alchemy turned the Zulu from a scattered people into an empire that could outmaneuver guns with spears. Now, shift the lens from the sun-baked plains of Africa to the misty mountains of Japan, where another warrior culture wielded invisibility as art. The ninja didn't have ancestral spirits guiding their strikes. They had shadows and the myths that turned those shadows into weapons. Ninja didn't just hide in shadows, they weaponized the darkness itself, turning superstition into strategy. Picture a shinobi crouched in a moonlit courtyard, his breath stilled, listening as guards whispered about the kitsune no yokai, fox demons said to walk as men. That wasn't fear to exploit, it was an opportunity to become legend. When villagers spoke of ninja vanishing into thin air or walking on water, These weren't exaggerations, they were carefully cultivated rumors spread by the Shino by themselves to magnify their power. A simple trick with smoke bombs became demon mist in the retelling, and a grappling hook left dangling from a wall transformed into proof of supernatural climbing abilities. Hattori Hanzo understood this alchemy better than most. Historical records describe him as a skilled tactician and bodyguard to Tokugawa Ieyasu, but folklore remade him into something far grander, a warrior priest who commanded Tengu, those winged tricksters of the mountains. Stories claimed he could summon storms to cover his movements or conjure fire from his fingertips. The genius, he never denied them. By letting these myths cling to him like a second cloak, Hanzo didn't just protect his lord, he became a living deterrent, a name that made enemies hesitate before striking. The ninja's true weapon wasn't the shuriken in their hand, but the story in their enemy's mind. Consider the infamous invisibility cloak, legends likely just a clever use of camouflage or distraction, yet so potent in rumor that samurai would swear they'd seen empty air move. Psychological warfare reached its peak with the art of hayamono, where ninja would plant forged documents suggesting divine curses on anyone who opposed them. A daimyo finding such a scroll might dismiss it as nonsense, until his best sentry vanished without a sound that night. This mystique wasn't accidental, it was institutional. Ninja clans trained not just in combat, but in folklore, studying which local spirits villagers feared most. A shinobi operating in Iga might impersonate a river kappa to explain strange footprints, while one in Koga could mimic the whistling cry of a yokai to signal allies. Their manuals didn't just teach lock-picking, they detailed how to stage supernatural occurrences, making statues bleed with hidden dyes or rigging temple bells to ring on windless nights. Every whispered tale of their powers made actual infiltration easier because fear opened doors faster than any lockpick. Now, shift your gaze from the misty forests of Japan to the frozen fjords of Scandinavia, where another group of warriors shattered expectations. Viking shield maidens didn't just fight alongside men, they rewrote the rules of what women could be in the medieval world. While ninja manipulated myths to terrify, these women embodied them to inspire, proving that courage had no gender. Shield maidens didn't just exist in Norse sagas, they walked the earth, their swords glinting beside those of their brothers and husbands. Take Lagertha, the legendary Viking ruler whose name echoes through history not as a queen who stayed behind castle walls, but as a warrior who fought alongside Ragnar Lothbrok himself. The sagas describe her battling with such ferocity that even seasoned warriors hesitated to face her. But Lagertha wasn't alone. Stories of Brynhilda, the Valkyrie cursed to mortal form, or Herva, who wielded her father's cursed sword, weren't just entertainment. They were blueprints for what women could become. These tales didn't just challenge gender norms, they shattered them, suggesting that the battlefield wasn't a man's world, but a realm where courage alone dictated who earned a place in Valhalla. Then came the Berserker grave, a discovery that sent shockwaves through history. Buried with a sword, axe, spear, and even gaming pieces typically reserved for military strategists, this warrior's tomb was clearly that of a high-ranking fighter. For over a century, scholars assumed it belonged to a man, until DNA analysis revealed the truth. The bones were female. Here was proof that shield maidens weren't just poetic inventions. They were flesh and blood, their existence etched not just in parchment, but in the soil of Scandinavia itself. The grave's artifacts spoke volumes. This woman hadn't just held a weapon, she'd mastered it, her burial goods mirroring those of the most revered male warriors. What's striking is how Norse society wove these women into its very fabric. While other medieval cultures confined women to domestic roles, Viking sagas celebrated them as strategists, explorers, and even rulers. Gudrid Thorbjornadottir didn't just stay home. she sailed to North America centuries before Columbus. Or the deep-minded didn't just inherit land, she commanded fleets, settling Iceland with the same authority as any Jarl. These weren't exceptions, they were proof of a culture that valued capability over gender. Even their laws reflected this. Viking women could divorce, own property, and demand compensation for insults, rights unimaginable in most of medieval Europe. Now shift your gaze from the frozen north to the sun-baked hills of Sparta, where another warrior culture redefined the limits of human endurance. The agoge wasn't just training, it was a crucible that forged boys into weapons. From the moment a Spartan child could walk, the state claimed him, stripping away softness like bark from a spear. At 7, boys left their families for the barracks, where hunger was a teacher and pain a lesson. They slept on reeds torn from the Eurotas River, their blankets so thin the cold kept them alert. Stealing food was encouraged, but getting caught meant a beating, not for the theft but for the failure of skill. The message was clear: survival wasn't a right, it was a test. Yet the agoge's true brilliance wasn't in its brutality, but in its psychology. Spartans didn't just train bodies, they sculpted minds. A boy who complained of hunger was given more rations, then mocked by his peers for weakness until he refused them. The goal wasn't to create mindless killers, but warriors who could endure anything and still think. Take the infamous diamastagosis, the ritual flogging at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Boys were whipped until their backs ran red, but the real test wasn't pain tolerance, it was who could stand silent the longest. The greatest honor wasn't avoiding the lash, it was enduring it with a smile. This wasn't hazing, it was alchemy. By the time a Spartan turned 20, he didn't just believe he was stronger than his enemies, he knew it. The agoge legends fed this confidence. Tales of King Leonidas tracing his lineage to Heracles, or the myth that Spartan mothers told their sons to return with their shield or on it. These stories didn't just inspire, they rewired reality, making death in battle seem not just acceptable but desirable. When 300 Spartans faced Persia's millions at Thermopylae, they didn't see impossible odds, they saw a chance to prove the agoge's myths true. And in doing so, they became myths themselves. The Spartan agoge didn't just train boys, it transformed them into living myths, each grueling step mirroring the trials of Heracles himself. Imagine a child no older than 7, stripped of comforts, his hunger a constant companion, his body pushed to the brink. This wasn't cruelty, it was a sacred reenactment. Just as Heracles faced the Nemean lion with bare hands, Spartan youths wrestled in the dirt, their scrapes and scars proof of their growing divinity. Every night spent shivering under thin reeds echoed Heracles' night in the frozen land of the Hyperboreans. Every stolen morsel of food, snatched under the noses of their elders, mirrored the hero's cunning theft of the golden apples. The message was clear: suffering wasn't punishment, it was initiation, a path to becoming something more than human. The legend of the 300 at Thermopylae didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the culmination of this mythic conditioning. When Leonidas and his men stood against Persia's endless ranks, they didn't see certain death, they saw their final labor, a chance to ascend to the halls of heroes alongside Heracles. Their defiance wasn't just tactics, it was theology. The Spartans believed their kings were direct descendants of Heracles, their bloodline a covenant with the divine. To flee battle would betray not just their city, but their very lineage. That's why the story of the 300 resonated far beyond Greece. It wasn't just about bravery, it was about mortals stepping into the footprints of gods. Now, shift your gaze from the rocky cliffs of Thermopylae to the lush plains of ancient India, where another warrior cast forth under an even older divine mandate. The Keshatrias didn't just serve kings, they served Dharma, a cosmic order woven into the fabric of existence. Their battles weren't mere conflicts, they were sacred duties, their swords extensions of Vishnu's will. In the Mahabharata, the great warrior Arjuna hesitates on the battlefield, his bow trembling at the thought of killing his own kin. It's Krishna, the god himself in mortal guise, who reminds him, for a Keshatria, honor lies not in avoiding war, but in waging it with righteous purpose. This moment, the Bhagavad Gita, wasn't just philosophy, it was the spiritual backbone of a warrior's life, a myth that turned duty into destiny. The Keshatriya's training mirrored this divine connection. Unlike the Spartans' relentless physical trials, their education balanced combat with scripture. A young warrior prince might spend mornings mastering the mace and evenings memorizing hymns to Indra, the thunder-wielding god of war. Their weapons weren't just steel, they were sacred objects blessed by priests and infused with mantras. The legendary bow Gandiva, wielded by Arjuna, wasn't merely a weapon, it was a relic from the gods, capable of unleashing arrows like monsoons. To hold it was to channel celestial power. What's fascinating is how these myths shaped real-world strategy. When the Keshatriya general Porus faced Alexander's armies at the Hydaspes, his war elephants weren't just beasts. They were avatars of Indra's mount, Airavata, their thunderous charge an echo of divine wrath. Even in defeat, Porus' defiance became legend, his refusal to surrender immortalized as the epitome of Keshatriya pride. These stories didn't just inspire, they blurred the line between earthly combat and cosmic drama, turning every battle into a stanza in an eternal hymn. From the riverbanks of India to the mountains of Greece, one truth emerges. The greatest warrior cultures didn't just wield swords, they wielded stories sharp enough to carve their names into eternity. The Bhagavad Gita didn't just guide Arjuna, it sculpted an entire warrior ethos, one where bloodshed and spirituality walked hand in hand. Picture a Keshatriya on the eve of battle, reciting verses under his breath, not for comfort, but to align his sword with cosmic order. His enemy wasn't just an opponent, he was a participant in a divine play, each clash a test of Dharma. When Krishna revealed his universal form on the battlefield, it wasn't spectacle, it was a revelation. War wasn't about winning, but about fulfilling one's sacred role without attachment to outcome. This paradox, fighting fiercely yet without hatred, became the heartbeat of Keshatriya culture, a balance so delicate few could walk its edge. Take Ashvatthama, the warrior whose legend serves as a dark mirror to Arjuna's enlightenment. Cursed for slaughtering innocents in his grief, his immortality became his prison, a walking warning against the poison of unchecked rage. Every Keshatriya knew his story, how the same hands that could invoke celestial weapons could also betray Dharma, turning victory into ashes. These myths weren't abstract, they pulsed through training grounds. Young warriors learned to string their bows only after meditating on the Gita's verses, their arrows symbolizing not just death, but the fleeting nature of life itself. Even their armor carried sacred inscriptions, turning every piece of steel into a prayer. Now, cross the vast Pacific to the deserts of the American Southwest, where another warrior culture wove myth into the fabric of survival. The Apache didn't have written scriptures, their doctrine lived in the whispers of the wind and the cunning of the coyote. Where Hindu warriors sought cosmic balance, Apache raiders embraced the chaos of the hunt, their battles less about duty and more about the raw will to endure. Their greatest weapon wasn't the bow or the knife, but the stories of Uzun, the life-giver, who taught them to move like shadows and strike like lightning. Picture a young Apache boy on his first raid, his mind humming with tales of the mountain spirits, their dances imprinted on his soul. He isn't just learning tactics, he's stepping into a legend older than memory. The stories told around campfires weren't entertainment, they were survival manuals wrapped in myth. When Geronimo spoke of his visions of voices promising no bullet could kill him, his followers didn't hear superstition, they heard prophecy. His raids became less about plunder and more about performance, a theater of defiance where every ambush proved the gods still whispered to their people. The contrast is striking. Where Keshatria saw war as a sacred geometry, the Apache treated it as an extension of the hunt, fluid, improvisational, relentless. Yet both cultures shared this. Their warriors didn't just fight. They became the living embodiment of their stories until the line between man and myth blurred beyond recognition. Whether facing British cannon or Mexican cavalry, that belief that they were characters in an eternal legend made them unstoppable. Apache warriors didn't just move through the desert. They became it, their tactics as shifting as the sands, their strategies whispered by the trickster himself. Coyote, the shape-shifting god of chaos, wasn't just a character in their stories. He was their battle instructor. Every ambush, every feigned retreat, every vanishing act in the canyon's shadow echoed his lessons. When a war party melted into the rocks after striking, leaving pursuers chasing ghosts, that wasn't just skill, it was Coyote's cunning made flesh. The myth wasn't separate from reality, it was the blueprint. Take the story of Coyote stealing fire from the gods. He didn't storm the heavens with brute force. He disguised himself, waited, and struck when least expected. Apache raiders internalized this. Why charge fortified positions when you could lure enemies into arroyos where the land itself became your ally? Their battles weren't clashes of lines but dances of deception, where victory went to those who could think like the trickster. Even their children's games reinforced this hide and seek wasn't play, it was training for the ultimate stakes. Then there was Geronimo, whose legend outran his footprints. Stories claimed he could see through hills, that bullets passed through him like wind through sagebrush. Some said he'd been granted this power in a vision, others that he'd bargained with spirits. The truth was almost as potent. His uncanny ability to evade thousands of soldiers for decades made the myth seem plausible. When he vanished into thin air after a raid, leaving cavalry to scour empty trails, it wasn't magic. It was Coyote's playbook executed to perfection. But the stories did something more. They demoralized his enemies. Soldiers who believed they hunted a man immune to bullets fought half defeated before the first shot. Now shift your gaze from the sun-baked mesas of the southwest to the orderly ranks of Rome, where another warrior culture marched under a very different kind of myth. The legions didn't rely on tricksters, they carried their gods with them, forged into the gleaming standards that led every charge. The eagle wasn't just a symbol, it was Jupiter's own messenger, a divine guarantee that Rome's destiny was written in the stars. To lose it in battle wasn't just a setback, it was sacrilege, a rupture in the pact between heaven and empire. When the legions advanced, their steps weren't just tactics, they were rituals. Before crossing a river, they'd sacrifice to its spirit. Before storming a fortress, priests read the flight of birds for omens. Even their battle formations mirrored cosmic order, the testudos interlocking shields like scales on Mars's armor. And woe to the general who ignored the signs. At Carrhae, Crassus marched past the sacred chickens that refused to eat, a bad omen he dismissed as superstition. His legions were annihilated by Parthian horse archers, their eagles lost in the desert sands. The message was clear: Rome's might flowed not just from steel, but from the favor of the gods. Yet the legions had their own trickster, not a coyote, but a wolf. The she-wolf who suckled Romulus and Remus wasn't just a founding myth, she was proof that Rome thrived on audacity. Her spirit lived in the daring night raids, the feigned retreats that lured enemies into traps, the engineers who built bridges in hours. Like the Apache, they understood that war wasn't just strength, it was theater. When Caesar's men raised a siege tower overnight, or when Scipio Africanus outmaneuvered Hannibal by marching through a swamp, they weren't just breaking rules, they were rewriting them with the wolf's cunning in their blood. From the desert to the forum, one thread connects these warriors. They didn't just fight for land or loot, they fought to prove their myths true, whether through Coyote's guile or Jupiter's eagles. And in doing so, they turned the battlefield into a stage where legends walked among men. Roman legions didn't just march under banners, they carried the soul of Rome itself in the form of the Aquila, that gleaming eagle standard said to pulse with Jupiter's favor. To lose one wasn't simply a military setback, it was a tear in the fabric of the empire's divine covenant. When Germanic tribes ambushed Varus's legions in the Teutoburg forest, capturing not one but 3 eagles, the shockwaves reached Rome's heart. Emperor Augustus reportedly wandered his palace for months, crying out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." The disaster wasn't measured in lost soldiers alone. It was the humiliation of gods watching their symbols fall into barbarian hands. Those recovered eagles later became more than reclaimed property. They were relics paraded through Rome like resurrected heroes. Now sail with me across oceans and centuries to Aotearoa, the land we know as New Zealand, where another warrior culture wore their myths not on standards but on their very skin. The Maori didn't need golden eagles. Their stories lived in the intricate moko tattoos that coiled across faces like living scrolls. Each swirling pattern was more than decoration. It was genealogy, history, and spiritual armor all at once. When warriors met in battle, they weren't just facing opponents. They were confronting entire lineages etched in ink, each curve proclaiming descent from gods like Tumatoanga, the fierce deity of war. Consider the haka, that thunderous dance outsiders often mistake for mere intimidation. Watch the warriors' eyes bulge, their tongues lashing like lightning. Every motion retells the myth of Tain Mahuta separating earth and sky, the cosmic struggle that birthed the world. When Maori warriors stomped their feet, they weren't just making noise, they were shaking the ground like the god Uamoko stirring in his mother's womb. These performances weren't preludes to battle, they were battles themselves, contests of mana where psychological victory could be won before a single spear was thrown. Parallels with Rome are striking. Where legionaries saw their Aquila as a conduit to Jupiter, Maori warriors viewed their tomoko as channels to their Atua ancestral spirits who guided their hands in combat. Losing one's tattooed identity was as unthinkable as a legion surrendering its eagle. When British forces confiscated sacred carvings during colonization, it wasn't just art they took, it was the physical manifestation of stories that had guided warriors for centuries. Yet, like the Romans who launched desperate campaigns to recover their eagles, Maori leaders today fight not with weapons, but in courts and museums, reclaiming these taonga as living myths rather than museum pieces. From the forests of Germania to the shores of Aotearoa, one truth emerges: the greatest warriors never fought alone. Whether carrying an eagle or wearing their ancestors' faces, they stepped onto the battlefield flanked by the invisible ranks of legend. Maori warriors didn't just wear their history, they lived it, etched into their skin with every chiseled line of the tomoko. These weren't mere tattoos, they were living scrolls, each curve and spiral a chapter of ancestry, conquest, and divine connection. Picture a warrior standing before battle, his face a map of triumphs and lineage, the patterns whispering of Tumatoanga's fury and Maui's cunning. To meet his gaze wasn't just to face a man, it was to confront generations of warriors, their stories coiled like serpents around his brow. The tomoko's power lay in its permanence. Unlike paint that could wash away, these marks were carved into the flesh, a declaration that identity and myth were one and the same. Consider the legend of Maui, the trickster demigod who lassoed the sun to slow its passage across the sky. His story wasn't just entertainment, it was a strategic blueprint. Maori warriors emulated his patience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, just as Maui had waited to ensnare the sun at dawn. Ambushes were timed with celestial precision, raids launched under cover of elongated twilight, a tactical homage to the god who taught them that time itself could be bent to their will. This myth didn't just inspire, it shaped an entire approach to warfare, where victory belonged to those who understood the rhythm of the heavens. Then there was the haka, a performance so visceral it blurred the line between ritual and combat. The stomping feet weren't just for show, they mimicked the earthquake god Yuamoko's tremors, shaking the earth to unsettle enemies. The bulging eyes and lashing tongues invoked ancestral spirits, transforming warriors into vessels of divine wrath. When performed before battle, the haka wasn't just intimidation. It was an invocation summoning the strength of those who had fought before. Opponents didn't just see a dance, they faced a living tapestry of myth, a crescendo of voices from the other side of the veil. The psychological impact was devastating. European settlers recounted how Maori warriors seemed to materialize from the mist, their tattooed faces and thunderous chants making them appear more supernatural than human. One British soldier described the experience as standing before a storm given human form. The moko and haka didn't just unsettle enemies, they rewrote reality, turning battles into encounters with the mythical. A warrior marked with the mana of his ancestors fought not for himself, but for the immortal legacy coiled in his skin. Now, shift your gaze from the verdant hills of Aotearoa to the sun-scorched deserts of Persia, where another elite force wielded myth as their ultimate weapon. The Immortals weren't just soldiers, they were an illusion, a legion that seemed to never diminish, their name whispering of divine favor. While Maori warriors drew power from their ancestors, the Immortals drew theirs from the eternal. Persian Immortals didn't just guard their king, they embodied an empire's unshakable belief in its own divinity. Picture this, an army of 10,000, their ranks never thinning, their numbers magically replenished overnight. When one soldier fell, another seamlessly took his place, creating the illusion of an eternal, undying force. This wasn't just clever logistics, it was theater on a grand scale, a living myth designed to terrify enemies and inspire loyalty. The name Immortals whispered of something supernatural, as if Ahura Mazda himself had blessed these warriors with endless life. And at their heart stood the Persian king, not just a ruler, but a divine instrument, his authority woven into the very fabric of the cosmos. The legend of Cyrus the Great cemented this divine connection. Stories claimed he was nurtured by a she-wolf, mirroring Romulus's mythic origins in Rome. But Cyrus's tale went further. His rise was foretold by dreams, his victories orchestrated by the gods. When he conquered Babylon, he didn't just take a city, he fulfilled prophecy, positioning himself as the chosen liberator of its people. These narratives weren't mere bedtime stories, they were the scaffolding of an empire. Every time the Immortals marched, their flawless ranks proclaimed the king's divine right, their unwavering discipline a reflection of cosmic order. To challenge Persia wasn't just rebellion, it was sacrilege. Now, shift your gaze from the sun-baked plains of Persia to the shadowed halls of medieval Europe, where another elite force wielded relics like weapons. The Knights Templar didn't just carry swords, they bore fragments of the divine itself. A splinter of the true cross, a vial of holy blood, even the fabled Holy Grail, these weren't just treasures, they were conduits to heaven's power. When Templars charged into battle, they weren't just fighting for land, they were crusading under the banner of sacred destiny, their every strike sanctified by the relics they guarded. The Templars' mythos was as meticulously crafted as the Immortals. Stories spread of their secret rituals, their unbreakable vows, their supernatural victories against impossible odds. Some whispered they possessed the Shroud of Turin, its holy imprint granting them protection. Others claimed they'd uncovered ancient secrets beneath Solomon's temple, turning knowledge into power. Whether true or not, these tales did something extraordinary. They transformed flesh and blood knights into something more than human, their very presence on the battlefield a declaration that God fought beside them. But here's the twist. The Templars' downfall came not from losing battles, but from losing control of their own myth. When Philip IV of France moved against them, he didn't just accuse them of corruption. He painted them as heretics who'd betrayed their sacred relics. Their legend, once their greatest strength, became the noose around their necks. Yet even in destruction, their stories endured, morphing into conspiracy theories and treasure hunts that still captivate us today. The lesson: myths can build empires or burn them to the ground. From Persia's undying warriors to Europe's holy knights, one truth remains: the greatest armies never march alone. They walk with gods at their backs and legends in their blades, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't steel, it's the story you believe. The Knights Templar didn't just guard relics, they became them, their very existence transforming into a kind of living myth. Take the Holy Grail, that elusive cup of Christ said to grant eternal life. While other knights searched for it, the Templars were whispered to possess it, their vaults rumored to hold not just the Grail but the very blood of divinity. These weren't just treasures, they were power condensed into objects, talismans that could legitimize kings or damn them. When Templars paraded fragments of the true cross through Jerusalem, they weren't displaying wealth. They were demonstrating a direct line to heaven, proof that God favored their swords. But relics weren't merely spiritual leverage, they were psychological warfare. The Shroud of Turin, with its ghostly imprint of a crucified man, wasn't just venerated, it was wielded. Imagine facing an enemy who claimed to carry the burial cloth of Christ himself into battle. Doubt crept in like a poison. If these men truly had heaven's favor, who could stand against them? The Templars understood that faith could unnerve foes faster than any cavalry charge. Then came Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, burning at the stake in 1314. His final words weren't pleas, they were prophecy. Before the flames took him, he cursed King Philip and Pope Clement, vowing they'd meet him before God within a year. And they did. Philip died screaming of Molay's ghost, Clement perishing weeks later. Coincidence, perhaps, but history remembers the tremor that ran through Europe, the whispers that the Templars' myths had teeth even in death. Now, cross continents to the kingdom of Dahomey, where another group of warriors turned myth into might. The Amazons weren't just fighters. They were living contradictions, women who shattered every expectation with blades in their hands and the gods in their corner. While Europe whispered of Templar secrets, Dahomey's warrior women marched in broad daylight, their very existence a revolution. Dahomey's Amazons didn't just fight, they became legends woven into the very soil of West Africa. Picture this, a battalion of women moving in perfect unison, their uniforms stark against the red earth, their war cries echoing like thunder. These weren't just soldiers, they were the living embodiment of Gu, the panther goddess who gifted them their ferocity. European colonizers who faced them didn't just see warriors, they saw something primal, a force that defied every expectation of gender and power. The stories they carried back to Europe weren't just reports, they were feverish tales of women who could scale walls barehanded, who fought with a fury that left battlefields littered with the wreckage of empires. But here's what those colonial accounts missed. The Amazons' true power wasn't just in their skill with blades or muskets, it was in the myths they carried. Gu wasn't just a symbol, she was a covenant. When an Amazon swore her oath to the king, she didn't pledge loyalty to a man, she bound herself to the goddess's will. Their training wasn't merely physical, it was spiritual. Initiates endured trials that mirrored Gu's hunt, silent stalks through the jungle, tests of pain tolerance, even ritual scarification that transformed their bodies into living maps of devotion. By the time they earned their place in the ranks, they weren't just fighters, they were avatars of divine retribution. Now, shift your gaze from the sun-baked plains of Dahomey to the mist-shrouded forests of Germania, where another warrior cult blurred the line between man and myth. The Berserkers' lesser-known cousins, the Ulfidnaar, didn't wear bare pelts, they cloaked themselves in the spirit of the wolf. Where Berserkers embodied Odin's frenzy, the Ulfidnaar channeled the lupine pack, silent, coordinated, relentless. Sagas describe them moving through battles like shadows, their howls syncing to some unseen rhythm, their attacks so precise they seem telepathic. Archaeology hints at the depth of their transformation. Grave sites reveal wolf teeth amulets clutched in skeletal hands, their placement suggesting these warriors didn't just admire wolves, they communed with them. Ritual pits filled with wolf bones and shattered weapons suggest ceremonies where men shed their humanity like old skins. The Ulfidnaar's genius lay in their duality. Where Berserkers relied on brute chaos, these wolf warriors fought with a chilling, calculated savagery. A lone Berserker might break an enemy line, but a pack of Ulfidnaar could dismantle an army from within, their coordination turning battles into hunts. The Norse weren't alone in this kinship with beasts. Across the Baltic, the Lithuanian Veals spoke of warriors who could shed their bodies entirely, their spirits running with the wolves under the full moon. These weren't fairy tales, they were survival strategies wrapped in myth. A tribe that believed its scouts could become wolves didn't just gain trackers, it gained living legends that made enemies hesitate to enter the forest at night. The line between man and animal wasn't just crossed, it was erased, rewritten by stories stronger than steel. From Dahomey's panther women to Germania's wolf warriors, one truth emerges: the most fearsome fighters never stood alone. They walked with myths at their heels, their every step a reminder that the right story can turn flesh and blood into something immortal. The Ulfidnaar didn't just wear wolf pelts, they shed their humanity with them, stepping onto the battlefield as something neither fully man nor beast. Where Berserkers roared with bear-like frenzy, these warriors moved in eerie silence, their coordination mirroring a wolf pack's lethal precision. Sagas describe their attacks as synchronized strikes, their howls rising in unison to summon the spirits of Odin's own wolves, Jerry and Freki. To face them wasn't just to battle warriors, it was to confront the wilderness itself, given teeth and claws. Their connection to Fenrir, the monstrous wolf of prophecy, added a layer of dread. Myths warned that Fenrir would devour Odin at Ragnarök, a destiny both terrible and inevitable. The Ulfidnaar embraced this duality, their fury a double-edged sword. They weren't just channeling the wolf's strength, they flirted with its damnation. Ritual pits unearthed across Scandinavia tell the story: wolf bones buried alongside shattered weapons, amulets carved from fangs clutched in skeletal hands. These weren't trophies, they were relics of transformation, proof that warriors once danced on the knife's edge between devotion and madness. The psychological impact was calculated terror. Imagine standing in a shield wall as the enemy's front line suddenly erupts in unearthly howls, their faces hidden behind wolf muzzles, their eyes glinting with something feral. Christian chroniclers later dismissed them as devil worshippers, but the truth was more profound. The Ulfidnaar didn't worship beasts, they became them, their very presence unraveling the enemy's courage before the first blow landed. Now, journey from the frozen Norse forests to the mist-wrapped peaks of China's Songshan Mountains, where another warrior tradition blurred the lines between myth and mastery. The Shaolin monks didn't howl at the moon, but their fists could shake the earth. Their legend begins not with a battle cry, but with a sigh of enlightenment. Bodhidharma, the wandering monk from India, didn't just bring Zen Buddhism to China. He planted the seed of a martial art infused with divine purpose. The story goes that Bodhidharma spent 9 years meditating in a cave, his gaze so intense it burned his likeness into the stone wall. When he emerged, he found the monks at Shaolin weakened by endless scripture study. So he taught them moving meditation exercises to strengthen body and spirit. These weren't just calisthenics, they were the first steps toward a revelation that the path to enlightenment could be walked with a staff in hand and a foot poised to strike. But the Shaolin's true mythic power lay in their connection to the celestial. Monks spoke of Qigong, the art of channeling life force, claiming mastery could let a man walk on rice paper without leaving footprints or strike a brick without breaking skin. Their forms weren't just techniques, they were prayers in motion, each stance named for the animals they emulated: the tiger's ferocity, the crane's grace, the snake's precision. To train at Shaolin wasn't just to learn combat, it was to align oneself with the rhythm of the universe, where every movement held the weight of millennia. The most legendary monks blurred the line between mortal and myth. Take Hui Neng, the sixth patriarch, who could reportedly snatch arrows from the air, or Bai Yu Feng, whose staff strikes sounded like thunder cracking stone. These weren't just skilled fighters, they were living testaments to the idea that discipline could unlock the supernatural. Even today, Shaolin's demonstrations, bodies bending spears with bare throats, palms shattering tiles, aren't just feats of strength. They're reminders that the right story, believed deeply enough, can turn flesh into something more. Shaolin monks didn't just practice martial arts, they transformed their bodies into living scriptures, every movement a verse written in sweat and discipline. But halfway across the world, beneath the towering canopies of the Appalachian forests, another warrior culture honed their own sacred connection to battle. The Cherokee didn't seek enlightenment through forms and stances. They found it in the whispers of the wind and the rituals passed down through generations. Where Shaolin monks channeled the tiger and the crane, Cherokee warriors invoked the spirit of the wolf and the hawk, their war ceremonies as precise as any kata. Before battle, Cherokee war parties didn't just sharpen their blades, they purified themselves in icy rivers, scrubbing their skin with rough stones until it burned. This wasn't mere cleansing, it was rebirth, stripping away fear and hesitation to emerge as vessels of the Great Spirit. Elders recited ancient incantations over them, calling upon the Ani Yunwiya, the principal people's ancestors, to guide their arrows. The warriors painted their faces with sacred symbols, not just for intimidation, but to wear the power of the animals they revered. A zigzag of red might invoke the lightning speed, while charcoal streaks mimicked the stealth of a stalking panther. These markings weren't decoration, they were contracts with the unseen world. Then came the dance. Unlike the Shaolin's disciplined forms, Cherokee war dances were fluid, unpredictable, mirroring the chaos of battle itself. Warriors circled the fire, their footfalls syncing to drums that pulsed like a collective heartbeat. Some fell into trances, their movements becoming jerky and instinctual, as if possessed by the spirits of past warriors. Observers described fighters who could dodge arrows mid-step, their bodies moving with an uncanny prescience, not unlike the Shaolin monks who seemed to anticipate an opponent's strike before it landed. Both traditions shared this truth. The greatest warriors didn't just train their bodies, they surrendered to something older than themselves. The Cherokee also had their own version of supernatural legends. Stories told of Ulagu, the raven mocker, a spectral being who stole the lives of the dying. Warriors who'd faced impossible odds and survived whispered of seeing ravens circling the battlefield, their cries mingling with the groans of the fallen. To the Cherokee, this wasn't superstition. It was a reminder that battle existed on two planes, the physical and the spiritual. A warrior who ignored the omens risked more than defeat. He risked losing his soul to the unseen forces that fed on chaos. Yet the most striking parallel between Shaolin and Cherokee warriors lay in their shared belief that combat was a sacred dialogue. For the monks, every block and strike was a meditation, a conversation with the universe. For the Cherokee, every raid and retreat was a negotiation with fate, a test of whether the spirits would favor their cause. Both cultures understood that true mastery wasn't about domination. It was about alignment, bending not just the body but the will to the rhythms of something greater. Now shift your gaze from the emerald forests of Cherokee lands to the windswept steppes of the Scythians, where warriors didn't dance with spirits, they rode with them, their very bones etched with the stories of their gods. Cherokee warriors didn't just prepare for battle, they summoned the storm itself. Before setting out, war parties gathered under the open sky, their faces upturned as elders called upon the thunder beings, those colossal spirits who rode the lightning and spoke in thunderclaps. The rituals weren't mere superstition, they were acts of communion. Warriors fasted, chanted, and painted their bodies with sacred symbols, zigzagging lines to mimic lightning, circles to represent the unbroken cycle of life and death. When the first rumble echoed across the mountains, it wasn't just weather, it was an answer. The thunder beings had acknowledged their plea, their presence a promise, fight with honor, and the storm would fight beside you. But the myths also carried warnings. The Uktena, a monstrous horned serpent with a diamond crest blazing on its forehead, lurked in Cherokee stories as a cautionary tale. Its very existence whispered of the dangers of arrogance, how even the mightiest warrior could be undone by pride. Legends told of hunters who sought the Uktena's gem for power, only to be devoured by their own greed. The message was clear. Victory wasn't just about strength, it demanded humility. A warrior who forgot this risked becoming like the Uktena itself, a creature so consumed by its own might that it lost its way. These stories weren't just told around campfires, they were etched into every decision on the battlefield. A war leader might call off a raid if the thunder beings withheld their storms, interpreting the silence as divine disapproval. Scouts moved with reverence, knowing the land itself was alive with spirits who could guide or betray them. Even the act of taking a scalp, a practice often misunderstood, was steeped in ritual. To the Cherokee, it wasn't mere trophy hunting. It was a way to capture an enemy's power while appeasing the spirits, ensuring balance. Every aspect of war, from the first chant to the final blow, was a dialogue with the unseen. Now, journey from the misty Appalachians to the towering peaks of the Andes, where another warrior culture waged battles under the watchful eye of a god who demanded far more than courage. The Inca didn't just fight for land or power, they fought for the sun itself. In Tai, the radiant sun god wasn't a distant deity. He was the lifeblood of the empire, his light sustaining crops, melting mountain snows, and most crucially, legitimizing the Sapa Inca's divine rule. To wage war was to serve in Tai's will, a sacred duty that transformed conquest into sacrament. Inca warriors marched into battle clad in tunics emblazoned with solar symbols, their maces and slings blessed by priests who'd traced the sun's path across the heavens. Before combat, they fasted and chewed coca leaves not for euphoria, but to sharpen their connection to the spiritual realm. The armies moved with precision, their formations mirroring the geometric perfection of Intai's celestial journey. Even their weapons carried mythic weight. The sling stones symbolized hail, hurled like divine punishment, while star-headed maces evoked the moon's submission to the sun's dominance. But the true power of Inca warfare lay in its psychological brilliance. When they annexed new territories, they didn't just subjugate, they assimilated, weaving local myths into their own solar cosmology. A conquered tribe's rain god might be rebranded as a servant of Intai, his storms now framed as gifts from the sun. This wasn't propaganda, it was alchemy. By reframing beliefs, the Inca turned resistance into reverence, ensuring that every victory strengthened not just their empire, but the very myths that held it together. The most striking parallel between Cherokee and Inca warriors: both understood that the greatest battles weren't fought with blades alone, but with stories so potent they could bend reality to their will. Whether summoning thunderstorms or serving a celestial sovereign, these warriors knew one truth: to fight without myth was to fight half-blind. The legends didn't just guide their hands, they ensured their deeds would echo far beyond the battlefield, written not in blood but in the stars. The Sapa Inca didn't just rule, he shone, his very blood alight with the sun god's essence. When he marched at the head of his armies, it wasn't just a king leading men, it was Intai himself stretching golden fingers across the earth. The myth of Pachacuti's vision wasn't mere propaganda, it was a seismic shift in reality. As the story goes, the young prince knelt by a spring when the heavens split open, and Intai lowered a golden disc into his hands. This wasn't a gift, it was a covenant. The disc, later fashioned into the Punchao idol, became the empire's pulsating heart, its surface etched with the faces of past rulers who'd become stars in the god's celestial court. Every conquest that followed wasn't ambition, it was obedience, the land unfolding like a sacred scroll for the sun's children to inscribe their destiny upon. But the myths went deeper than royalty. Inca commoners carried Intai's light too, woven into the very fabric of their warfare. Before battle, soldiers fasted under the sun's gaze, their lips stained green from sacred coca leaves, not to numb pain but to sharpen their vision, to see as Intai saw. Their slings weren't just tools, they were miniature cosmologies, the whirling cords mimicking the sun's path as stones flew like meteors. Even their battle formations mirrored celestial patterns, troops maneuvering in precise geometries that echoed the solar hierophanies priests charted in temple observatories. To fight as an Inca wasn't to wage war, it was to perform the sun's eternal dance of order over chaos. Now, let the Andes' golden glare fade into the emerald haze of ancient Ireland, where another warrior band ran wild under a very different kind of myth. The Firena didn't answer to sun gods, they were wed to the wilderness itself, their loyalty split between kings and the untamed magic of the land. Where the Inca moved with solar precision, the Firena flowed like mist through the oaks, their stories humming with shapeshifters, talking deer and portals to the other world. Their leader, Fionn Mac Cumhale, wasn't just a fighter, he was a man who tasted the salmon of wisdom and gained the power to see through time. But here's the twist, the Firena's greatest strength wasn't prophecy, it was paradox. They were both guardians and outlaws, poets and killers, straddling the line between civilization and the wild like no warriors before or since. Consider the legend of the Firena's initiation. A candidate had to stand in a waist-deep pit, armed only with a shield and stick, while 9 warriors hurled spears at him. If he flinched, he failed, but the true test came after. He had to braid his hair without tangles, run through the forest without snapping a twig, and leap over a branch as high as his forehead. These trials didn't just measure strength, they sought harmony. A Firena warrior had to be as lethal as a wolf, yet as gentle as the breeze, his violence balanced by an almost sacred respect for nature's rhythms. When they hunted, they sang to the deer first, apologizing for the kill. When they fought, their battles were as much about riddles and poetry as sword strokes. The Inca saw conquest as a divine geometry. The Firena saw it as a conversation with kings, with fairies, with the very trees that whispered secrets to those who listened. Wherein Tai's warriors carried the sun's certainty, Fion's band thrived in the liminal spaces dawn and twilight, the borderlands between myth and mortal soil. Their stories didn't just inspire courage, they asked a haunting question. Can you be both wolf and man, both blade and verse? The answer lived in their legends, where every sword swing carried the weight of a riddle, and every victory tasted bittersweet like stolen otherworld fruit. Fionn mac Cumhaill didn't just catch a fish, he swallowed destiny. The legend of the Salmon of Knowledge begins with an ordinary river, but what emerged from its waters was anything but. A humble poet named Finnegas had spent years waiting to catch this mythical fish, fated to grant infinite wisdom to whoever tasted its flesh. But when the salmon finally bit, it wasn't the poet who received its power. Young Fionn, tasked with tending the fire, touched the blistering skin and burned his thumb. Instinctively, he sucked the wound, and in that moment, the salmon's knowledge flooded into him instead. This wasn't just a lucky accident, it was the universe rewriting itself, choosing a warrior poet to carry Ireland's deepest truths. From that day forward, Fionn saw the world differently. When he pressed his thumb to his teeth, the present peeled back like a curtain, revealing hidden paths and future battles. But here's what the myths often overlook. This wisdom didn't just make him a strategist, it made him a bridge between realms. The Firena, his band of elite warriors, weren't merely fighters, they were keepers of a fragile balance between humankind and the otherworld. Their battles weren't just against rival clans, but against forces that sought to unravel the very fabric of reality. Take the story of the Firena's most impossible feat, the pursuit of the enchanted deer. When an ordinary hunt led them to a stag that leaped taller than trees and spoke in human tongue, they didn't flee in terror, they followed. For days, the chase twisted through forests that thickened into myth, where time slowed and the air hummed with magic. When Fionn finally cornered the creature, it didn't beg for mercy. It challenged him to a riddle contest, its eyes glowing with ancient knowing. This was no beast but a shapeshifter from Tyr Na and Og, the land of eternal youth. The Firena's victory wasn't won with spears, but with wit, proof that their greatest strength lay in harmonizing brutality and wisdom. Yet the Firena's true power resided in their duality. By day, they enforced the High King's laws. By night, they feasted with fairies. Their initiation rites demanded superhuman feats, leaping over branches as tall as a man, reciting poetry while dodging thrown spears, but also impossible gentleness. A candidate had to sprint through the forest without snapping a single twig, his footsteps lighter than a deer's. This wasn't just training, it was a sacrament, a way to hone the body without severing the soul's connection to the wild. Modern Ireland still bears their fingerprints, in the way a storyteller's voice drops to a hush when recounting Fionn's adventures, in the stubborn belief that certain hills and rivers are portals to the other world. Even in the quiet pride of hikers who tackle the Giant's Causeway, where myth claims Fionn built a stone path to Scotland. These aren't just fairy tales, they're cultural DNA, strands of identity that survived Vikings, famine, and centuries of upheaval. When an Irish poet writes about justice or a rebel sings of freedom, they're channeling the same spirit that once guided the Firena, the unshakable belief that some truths are worth defending, not just with steel, but with stories that outlast empires. The salmon's wisdom didn't die with Fionn. It swims still in the collective memory of a people who have always understood that the line between history and myth is thinner than a blade of grass. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of all, that the stories we tell about ourselves don't just describe who we are, they shape who we become. From the bone-chilling howls of Norse berserkers to the silent discipline of samurai swordsmen, these myths did more than entertain, they rewired reality. They turned ordinary men into vessels of divine will, their battles into sacred rites, their very breath into the rhythm of legends. But this wasn't just ancient history. Look around today, and you'll see their echoes everywhere in the superheroes who dominate our screens, the games where we wield mythical blades, even in the way we still whisper about honor, sacrifice, and destiny. These stories didn't fade, they evolved, proving that the human hunger for myth is as relentless as ever. Think of the last time you felt chills watching a hero rise against impossible odds. That surge of inspiration, it's the same fire that once burned in a Spartan's chest as he faced Persia's armies, or a Zulu warrior's heart as he charged into rifle smoke. The names and faces have changed, but the essence remains. We still crave stories that tell us we're capable of more than we imagine. Whether it's a Viking saga or a modern blockbuster, the magic lies in that transformation, the moment a person steps into their myth and becomes something greater. So the next time you lose yourself in an epic tale, pause and listen closely. Beneath the spectacle, you'll hear the whispers of ancient warriors, their lessons still sharp. That hero's journey, it's the same path walked by knights seeking the Grail, the villain's downfall, a reflection of the Cherokee's warnings about pride and the Ulfidnaar. These patterns endure because they speak to something timeless in us, the hope that courage, loyalty, and conviction can still shape the world. Now it's your turn. What legends stir your imagination? Share your favorite warrior myth in the comments, whether it's the cunning of Coyote, the fury of the Morrigan, or the unbreakable will of the 47 Ronin. And if you've enjoyed this journey through the myths that forged history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me as we keep unraveling the stories that shape us. After all, the greatest legends aren't just told, they're lived. Until next time, may your own story be worthy of the telling.